Hello, very beautiful community. Emmanuel Macron says it's time to engage in substantive dialogue with the Kremlin. What kind of game is Macron playing? I'll give a quick analysis of that. And is it a good game to play? Now, we'll analyze this by taking a quick peek at a Mark Galeotti piece in The Spectator, where he extensively quotes Macron. I believe that it's in our interest as Europeans and Ukrainians to engage in dialogue with Moscow in the coming weeks, Macron says. Galeotti explains that Macron is simply recognizing that Russia isn't going away, and if you let the Trump people lead, you're going to be in this dynamic where they lead, and then the Europeans, once the Trump people have conceded too much to the Kremlin, have to then come in and do an emergency fire brigade response. Macron says there are two outcomes. If we get a substantive deal, we've got to talk to the Russians anyway. If we don't, we've got to start talking to them nevertheless too. Galeotti says there's a quietly emerging sentiment in Europe that shunning Putin because he's bad doesn't work. Finnish President Alexander Stubb, no friend of Putin's, cautiously endorsed this idea while warning it can't be done on a nation-by-nation basis. And Galeotti says that, look, if you do it on a nation-by-nation basis, Putin will just play divide and conquer and take advantage of us. But Galeotti says it's time for the UK and France and Germany to come together on a continental basis and engage in talks with the Kremlin. This won't achieve anything quickly, but it'll be the start of a process of reshaping a relationship with Russia that, however antagonistic, can't be left to the Kremlin, to the White House to dictate. You see, a slip of the tongue there that's not entirely inappropriate. Now, by which I don't mean, of course, that Trump's a Russian agent. What I mean by that is that Trump shares much with the Kremlin ideologically, in a kind of sharing of a might is right fascist monarchism. So before we analyze whether this is a good idea and what Macron's trying to do, let's do a little bit of discourse prophylaxis. Marko Mikkelsen, the Estonian politician, says, unfortunately, this is total nonsense in response to Galeotti, especially coming from an internationally renowned expert on Russia, or perhaps a consultant for Russia. He's smearing Galeotti with the notion, which he knows is fake, that Galeotti is working for the Kremlin. Galeotti responds, don't like the message, so don't engage, just smear me with the claim that I'm working for the Kremlin. Classy. But then if you're smearing me as a Russian stooge, shouldn't you smear Macron too? Because he is saying the same thing. So what's happened there to Mikkelsen is that he's not asked the question, is Galeotti right or wrong about the point he's making? He's instead asked the question, is Galeotti emitting the right kind of anti-Kremlin signals, right? So the first is about discourse, intellectual engagement, and correct or incorrect political positioning. The second is about bot-like engagement with the surfaces of speech. It's a depoliticized activity, which you shouldn't confuse with the asking of the substantive question about whether Galeotti's got this right or wrong. So let's say something about that, and firstly about what Macron's trying to do. So the way to understand this is not that Macron thinks we've got to speak with Putin and see what kind of constructive outcomes we can get. That's not really what's happening. What's really happening is that Macron is trying to recapture a little bit of agency for himself and a little bit of agency for Europe. And the way he's doing that is by knowing that it's going to be futile to talk to Putin. But he's saying, look, I'll do some futile dialogue with Putin to reestablish European agency, not cede initiative to the Trump people, and then also demonstrate to the Trump people that we are trying to supposedly bring an end to the conflict too, and that it's Putin who is refusing. So the aspiration for Macron is not that it's constructive to speak to Putin. in some substantive way that's going to achieve a breakthrough, but that it's going to be futile. But in being futile, it'll advantageously reposition Europe and perhaps disadvantageously reposition Putin vis-a-vis the White House. Now, I don't exactly know what Mark's view is on the basis of this piece. I'm just going to say that there is one view in these waters that is definitely wrong, and that is that at the moment, dialogue can substantively be an end in itself. It can't, for two reasons. Putin still has maximalist aims of political control over Ukraine. That's the first reason. The second reason is that the Europeans do not have a strategy. And they do not have a strategy which they can back up with practical steps. So there is no substantive place for the dialogue to go unless there's a shift on these two. And what are the prospects of a shift on these two? It's essentially zero. Putin is not even remotely close to giving up maximalist aspirations for political control over Ukraine, and the Europeans are certainly not going to develop a strategy. And so there's nothing much wrong with talking to Putin, but there is also nothing much right with talking to Putin insofar as they're not the ingredients at the moment for that to lead to any substantive outcome. Lots of love. Talk soon.